Hello everyone, my name is Maria and today we are analyzing my latest London Chess League game. I'm going to explain to you my thought process, walk you through lines that I've calculated during the game, as well as lines that were revealed in my analysis with Stockfish afterwards. Don't forget that analyzing your games is key in making progress. The time control of the London League this season is 75 minutes and 15 seconds increment for the entire game. So it's not really rapid, but it's not as generous as other classical formats either. For example, in many tournaments, the norm tends to be 90 minutes plus 30 seconds increment per move, with an additional of 15, 30, even 60 minutes bonus after 40 moves. Another particular thing about this league is that all games happen in the evening, which means that I have the whole day to prepare. No, I have the whole day to get really tired at work. But I guess the same is kind of true for my opponents as well, so I'm not going to insert too many excuses here. But anyway, games can start as late as 7:30. This one was due to start at 6:30, but to my surprise, my opponent was late. Pretty late. No judgment here. I'm literally late all the time. And when he arrived, he looked like he had been running to make it in time, which I really appreciated. But still, he was late enough that I had time to take out my book, read a few chapters, get really hungry, and then not really be in that much of a fighting mindset anymore. Anyway, he started the game with 1e4 and 40 minutes left on the clock. Once he sat down, I decided, and not just because I was really hungry, that I should really tap into my inner Nepo and play this game really quickly to keep the time advantage. So I went with my usual French defense, knight f3, pawn to d5, and here my opponent decided to take on d5. This was a bit of an eye roll moment for me. I'm sure many of you are familiar with all the chess memes about the French defense exchange variation and how French defense players tend to hate playing against it. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad opening. It's not. It's just that it's considered that there are much more ambitious ways for white to continue here, such as playing pawn to e5 or playing knight to c3, or way more common to just go pawn to d4 here instead of knight to f3. But anyway, my opponent took on d5, and after takes, d4, bishop d6, we are full on in the exchange variation territory. Now here my opponent responded with c4, and I have to say this move really triggered my inner Kelly Kapoor. I was just kind of there like, how dare you? How dare you play the exchange, but then not really play the exchange because instead you're playing this setup that I actually really hate playing against. So this move is basically an invitation to an IQP or isolated queen spawns position. So after black eventually takes on c4, this invites to an old chess conversation where white is basically arguing that the space advantage and the center control that he's getting thanks to that pawn on d4, the nice piece development, and just generally good middle game plans is far more relevant than the fact that d4 is structural weakness. Black, on the other hand, is of course arguing the opposite. So black thinks that he's gonna hold on in the middle game and then slowly simplify and make it to an endgame where he can put pressure on the pawn on d4, win it for free, and then win the game. Now, why did I say that I hate playing against the c2, c4 variation? Well, this has to do with quickly losing some games in this opening when I was younger and less experienced. So I remember that something that happened to me was moving out this bishop out of c8, not exactly in this moment, but you get the general idea. And I was greeted with queen to b3, double attack on f7 and b7. This was one thing that happened to me. Now I have another vague memory of a game that I don't quite recall the details, the when and where of the game. Maybe because it was too painful of a memory for my brain to actually store. But something along the lines of bishop takes f7, knight g5, queen b3, checkmate happened to me here many years ago. But hey, it's important in life to face your fears, so here I am playing against the system. Now, instead of taking directly on c4, I went for c6. So in my head, I knew that I was going to take on c4 eventually, but of course this move still gives white the option of changing their mind and going for takes or c5, which are both pretty decent options. Now, I thought here that since white played pawn to c4, then they probably do want to go for an IQP position. And I was right, my opponent responded bishop to d3. Here I took, so just an old school trick to make the opponent move the bishop twice. So waiting to take on c4 until after the bishop has moved out of f1. It doesn't make a huge difference, but it still makes you feel kind of good seeing your opponent just having to grab the same piece twice and moving it 2 times in a row. My opponent took back with the bishop, we have knight f6, and now bishop to g5. Now, I do think that g5 is the correct square for the bishop in this type of positions, but I also think that it would have been more accurate for my opponent to short castle here first, because given all my fears about getting, kingside attacked in the middle of the game, all because of that pawn on d4, I found a really quick exit out of this whole scenario by playing queen e7 check. And this basically invites to a queen's trade, and of course white doesn't have to go for it, so they can still retreat either one of the two bishops, but this would still feel like a small victory to me because I put the queen on a decent square, e7, whereas my opponent moved the same piece like the second or the third time. But instead, my opponent went for queen e2, and I quickly traded queens. Now, I know what you're thinking, and before you roll your eyes and, say to yourself or write it in the comments that you don't want to watch some, like, dull endgame, and I'm with you on that. Let me just promise you that this game is still gonna get kind of juicy. So we have some force variations coming up, some cool tactics, and even a brilliant checkmate net that I completely missed during the game. But hey, that still counts, right? Knight e4 to not allow the bishop to take on f6. So white continued with bishop h4, I short castled, they short castled as well, and rook to e8. Now, this sets up for a pretty trivial trap that my opponent unfortunately didn't fall for. So if knight d2 here, which seems kind of natural, then after trades, the rook simply collects the bishop on e2, and black just has a devastating position. So instead, my opponent went for bishop to d3, also getting the bishop out of the x-ray of that rook. And I played bishop to g4 with the clear intention of capturing on f3 next move. Now, in the game, I didn't think that it would be good for white to allow me to take on f3 and further damage their pawn structure. So I was expecting something like knight to d2 here from my opponent. But instead, he played rook to e1, a move that I anticipated, but I also didn't think that it was very good. And I calculated the following. After bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3, it kind of looks like my knight on e4 is pinned on the rook, and that sounds like a problem because then pawn takes e4 should simply win the knight next move. However, the reality is the knight f6 here just saves the day because bishop takes f6 is impossible thanks to rook takes e1. Whereas rook takes e8, black can just recapture with the knight, and as you can see, my kingside pawns are still in a pretty nice formation. So when white played rook to e1, I thought that perhaps my opponent had missed this knight going back to f6 idea. So I quickly took on f3 and retreated to f6. It turns out that the engine is not particularly impressed with my position here. So I guess this brings up another old chess argument. How much can the bishop pair compensate for an inferior pawn structure? And of course, the position here fits into that discussion, but I think more practically, I would say that despite white's weaknesses, it's not like black is just going to win one of those pawns within a few moves. There is still much more ahead. So my opponent developed with knight d2. I brought the knight to d7 as well, and knight e4. Something that was very clear to me after knight e4 was that I did not want to take on e4. So after takes, white basically fixes 80% of their pawn structure problems, because the f pawns are no longer doubled and d4 is no longer isolated as well. So of course this is not a tragic position for black or anything, so there are still some weak squares in white's position, but it just feels like an improvement for white, so there was no reason for me to go for this. So instead, bishop to b4, attacking the rook on e1. Now, funnily enough, white still doesn't have time to double up my pawns here. So after knight takes f6, knight takes f6, there is no bishop takes f6 because of rook takes e1, and this is once again kind of devastating for white, because they're just left with an exchange down. Whereas rook takes e8, knight takes e8, and same situation as before. In response to bishop b4, then my opponent played rook to e2, and I moved the knight to h5 to target the f4 square, maybe even catch a nice pretty fork against the rook and the bishop. Bishop g5 followed, and here I went for h6. h6 was a very quick and automatic response on my side, so I thought that it's very unlikely for this move to have any negative consequences, and even though h7 is not exactly ideal for my king to move to at the moment, it's not like that bishop on d3 is bound to stay there forever. So at the end of the day, I might still have an escape square for my king if need be. Now, this also gives white the opportunity to make a mistake here. So even though there aren't that many retreating squares for the bishop to d2 would work in my favor here, because after trades, black just starts putting pressure on d4 and perhaps even f3, and white doesn't have the bishop pair anymore. So instead, my opponent played bishop to e3, which is the right call. I went knight to b6, trying to bring the knight to d5, and my opponent continued with a3 and bishop to f8. Now, this move might look ugly to you, but there weren't in fact that many squares for my bishop to move to. So another square is bishop to e7, but to me this didn't feel like a better diagonal for the bishop to be on compared to f8, and it's also blocking my rook on e8. Whereas, of course, bishop a5 is just a complete catastrophe after b4. That bishop is virtually bye-bye. So, bishop f8. Now, I did promise my bishop that once given the chance, I would move it out of there and let it unleash its wrath on some other diagonal. And spoiler alert, that didn't really come to reality, because literally the next time I moved my bishop, it got captured next move. But don't worry, if we were to personify chess pieces, I'm sure they would all be teammates. So bishop f8. Now my opponent continued with knight c3. We have rook to d8, reinforcing the control over that d5 square. Bishop to c2, probably just moving the bishop out of that rook's x-rays. And now knight to d5 and bishop to b3. If the moves so far came to me relatively easily, so after bishop b3, I really had to take my head in my hands and have a deep think, because white is asking me a very, very simple question. Do you want a pawn on d5? And I just felt like, no thanks, I'm good. I want my queenside pawns to stay together as they currently are. But I still need to make a decision regarding my knight on d5. Now, before I go into the most tempting continuation here, which is also the correct one, to just plant the knight on f4, I also want to explore a little bit some other lines that I considered, or some other ideas. So one obvious thing here is knight takes c3, but after pawn takes c3, this position didn't really entice me, so I didn't feel like I achieved that much. I felt like, on the contrary, I helped white get a slightly better version of the structure that they previously had. Because now, yes, they still have many pawn islands, but at least the b file is open and c3 and d4 are now together. So all in all, this didn't seem very enticing to me. Computer still thinks that it's an equal position, so this is by all means playable. Another idea was to take on e3, and in the same spirit, white would take back with the pawn, so undoubling the pawns, supporting the d4 square. This didn't feel very enticing to me either, but I guess if I had to pick a capture, I think I would have probably picked the e3 one. I'm actually not sure. And another thing that I considered was to reinforce the knight on d5 with knight h to f6. Now, this seemed like a pretty good move, but it didn't seem very aggressive, so I just decided to keep it as a backup while I calculate jumping with one of my knights on f4. Now, before even deciding which knight should go on f4, one line that black must figure out quickly is what happens if the bishop takes and then the rooks get traded. And this variation is common for both knight moves. So say knight h to f4, we have bishop takes f4, knight takes f4, rook takes d8, rook takes d8. This is the line that I considered during the game. And here after d5, c takes d5, knight takes d5. In this position, I thought I should be fine. So I hadn't decided if I was going to trade knight or go for knight d3. But overall, I was optimistic about the prospects of my rook going into the second rank. Here, instead of taking on d5, the computer actually finds a cleverer continuation for black, which is to go for rook to d8. Now, in the game, I thought that it wouldn't be good for me to allow white to split up my queenside pawns. But as it turns out, the compensation, or not even the compensation, but the activity that the black rook gets by infiltrating through either d3 or d2 is just more relevant than the fact that the pawns are no longer together. So, for example, if white tries to attack that c6 pawn with bishop a4, we have rook to d2. And after bishop takes c6, even rook takes b2 is good enough here. So black is just gonna keep on putting pressure on white's weak pawns. But even better is knight h3 check. And after king g2 takes on f2. And white is probably not even gonna have time to push on the queen side before black manages to capture at least the h2 pawn. So this position looks very promising for black. Now, I didn't appreciate this. I think I didn't think about rook d8 altogether. Maybe if I actually had this position on the board, I would have considered it, but this didn't actually happen. So getting back to the game, I still had to decide whether I go with the h knight to f4 or with the d knight to f4. Now, despite spending 20, maybe 10 minutes here, or between 10 and 20 minutes here, because there was quite a critical moment, I unfortunately made the wrong call. So I went with the knight from d to f4, which is not a throwaway or anything, but it is an inaccuracy. Now, I guess moving the d5 knight to f4 just kind of leaves my knight on h5 in a bit of a dubious situation. Also, now the white rook is able to unpin or just move out of the e-file, which was previously not available for them because of knight takes e3, and black just easily wins a pawn. But anyway, this was my decision to go with the d knight. My opponent played rook to d2, and here I moved knight to g6 with the plan of jumping into h4 and putting pressure on the f3 pawn. And I thought this would be even more so annoying since after knight h4, white doesn't have king g2 to easily and cleanly defend that pawn on f3. Now, my opponent responded with d5, which is very dynamic and creates many practical chances for them. I responded with knight h4 and now bishop to d1. Now, as we know, not all retreating moves are bad. You've seen my bishop f8 earlier, that was quite alright, and there are some even brilliant retreating moves and retreating ideas. However, bishop d1 here has a pretty big red flag, which has to do with the rook on a1 being cut off the back rank. And how is this relevant? Well, it's quite funny, but if black could just pick up this rook and, just throw it on the other side of the board, then rook e1 would be checkmate. Look at that. My knight on h4 is suddenly having a really important role in restricting that king on g1. This also means that the bishop on e3 is pinned, which immediately made me thought of ways to try to exploit the pin. And one of these ways is to bring the knight to f4. Now, this was my main candidate move, and unfortunately, I ended up not going for it for a miscalculation that I will show in a second. What is the point of knight f4? Well, it looks really good to have that knight there, I'll just say that. It also attacks the d5 pawn, and most importantly, it's not hanging because of rook e1 checkmate. So, it turns out that the best move, according to the computer here, is for white to just keep their cool and play king to h1, just kind of getting out of any potential knight f3 with a check ideas, and allow black to take on d5 and just try to complicate the games afterwards. So I thought about this position and I thought I should have the upper hand. Now, the computer doesn't seem to think that this is catastrophic for white, so I guess the bishop pair and the fact that the d5 pawn can still become a target have something to do with that. Now, the line that I was actually calculating, because to be honest, I did not consider king h1 at all. I thought that white has to do something, has to respond to my knight f4 move by playing pawn takes c6 to not allow me to take on d5. And this is where a really beautiful enforced line begins. Now, first of all, taking back on c6 is not really a good option for black, because after something like trades and bishop takes h7, things can get really messy. And actually, the engine slightly prefers white here all of a sudden. But what I had in mind here was actually a much prettier move, and it's rook takes e3. Oh, come on, I said it in the wrong moment. And it's rook takes e3. And the idea is very simple. So you can't take on d8 because of rook e1, and that g2 square is literally fortified by my knights. Whereas pawn takes e3, you want to first check on h3 before taking the rook. And after king to h1, rook takes d2. And this is a line that I calculated, and at first I was really happy with. And then it dawned on me that white can play pawn to c7. And this move really scared me, especially having to calculate it for a distance. So, you know, I know this sounds like an excuse, but it's important for the context that I had to calculate this whole thing from here. So you don't really decide to go knight f4 if you don't know what you're gonna do after pawn takes c6. And since taking back is not really an option, you really have to be sure about this line. So after knight f4, pawn takes c6, rook takes e3, pawn takes e3, knight h3, king h1, rook takes d2, pawn to c7. Pause the video for a second and see if you can work out for yourself what is black's ingenious idea to get out of trouble here. Did you find it? Okay, nice. So here black can go rook to g2, and this is pretty much threatening two different checkmates, and there's just nothing white can do to try to prevent both of them. Not even promoting into a queen helps. And this is actually, like, you know, really big kudos to my bishop on f8, because if it wasn't for my bishop on f8, then c8 would have come with a check, you know, promoting into a queen with a check, and then the knight on h3 would have been hanging. So that would have been pretty devastating for me. Now, unfortunately, when calculating from a distance, I missed the rook g2 idea, so I just thought that here I must be losing. Despite being a pawn up, I just can't prevent the pawn from promoting. Now, I'm also going to show what happens if white tries to go with the king on f1 instead. I think this leads to a very cool checkmate, because after rook takes d2 c7, pause the video, see if you can find the checkmate for yourself. Well done if you did. Rook f2 check, king e1, knight g2, and this is checkmate. And come on, how cool are my knights? Like, I literally started with them from here, then I got them like this. So with two knights like this, and now look at the checkmate that they're making happen. Very impressed with my pair of knights. instead of all this, unfortunately, I succumbed to fear and didn't think that the knight f4 was going to work. And again, not because of king h1, but because of this pawn takes c6, pawn to c7 idea. So instead, I took on d5, which, as we can see, is an inaccuracy, and now the position is back to 0-0, but don't worry, not for too long. White took back with the knight, and here I played rook to d6. And this move, well, even psychologically, this moment felt a bit like a miss. So in the previous position, where I decided to take on d5, I felt that I had built up to something. I felt that my position had a lot of like energy and potential, and it smelled like tactics. But then I didn't find anything, so not going for knight f4, despite really wanting to, killed my vibe a little bit. So yeah, rook d6. Now, what did I want with rook d6? Well, I was thinking maybe I'll just like swing my rook to the side, or just double up on one of these open files. Now, of course, I cannot really double up the other way around, so with like rook e5 or rook e6, this would be a tragedy because knight f6 and black just loses the rook on d8. After knight takes d5, rook to d6, my opponent continued with bishop to e2, a very logical move to just put an end to the rook e1 checkmate ideas for the time being. I continued with pawn to b6, so just blocking the bishop from taking my a7 pawn. My opponent sheltered the king to h1, so I guess they just didn't want to worry about this knight landing on f3 with a check. So now maybe white can calculate moving the bishop out of there without having to worry about knight f3 check. I went knight to f6. Here we trading knight, and my opponent responded with rook to d7. Now, instead of rook d7, the computer prefers a more settled approach with rook c1 and b4. It's pretty much saying, okay, let black take the pawn on f3. It's not going to be the end of the world. And deems rook d7 as an inaccuracy. Now, in the game, when I was calculating rook d7, because I calculated it before moving my knight to f6, I thought that this is the most natural, tempting, kind of scary looking idea for my opponent. So I was expecting him to go for it. I decided to take my chances against it anyway, but then once he baited, I started hesitating as well, as I'm about to show. But basically the problem with moving this rook to d7, as enticing as it seems, is that I think now the consequence is that the bishop on e2 is no longer protected, which suddenly gives my black rook a new idea to fight for. And consequently, the best move for black here, a move that once again I calculated and I really wanted to go for it, and then I just kind of didn't, was bishop to c5. And what's really cool about bishop to c5 is that after white takes, black can literally choose which bishop they want to take. And funny enough, both of them are quite decent options. Now, the reason I didn't go for bishop c5 here was that after pawn takes c5, I worried that after something like bishop c4, knight takes f3, rook takes c7, I just don't really know what to make out of this position. So I was imagining it in my head and just feeling insecure about it, because on one hand, I like black's piece activity, I like the flexibility of the rooks, even though I wasn't seeing concrete moves that clearly, but I was also worried about white's passed pawn on the a file. Now, of course, in my cozy flat, days after playing the game, I can easily say that rook e5, rook h5 looks like a very, very troubling idea for the white king. So probably white is not gonna have much time to push the a pawn, because black is already gonna start creating pretty painful threats against the white king. Instead, however, I decided to go for pawn to a5, which is a move that just transmits hesitation. So I was hoping to go for bishop to c5, but I wasn't sure about allowing white to take my pawn on a7. And out of this whole uncertainty, I just decided, okay, you know what? I'm just gonna push my pawn so that I don't have to worry about it anymore. And this misses out on bishop d5, which is why it is an inaccuracy. But luckily for me, my opponent didn't make the most precise move here and went for rook to c1. Another move that, in my opinion, looks very, very tempting. You are kind of fighting, or at least it looks like you're fighting against bishop c5. You're thinking of maybe bringing up this other rook and just generally putting the rook on the other open file in this position. But here I finally got my moment and went for bishop c5, and well, what did I tell you? That bishop literally got taken next move. But here, instead of recapturing on c5, I decided that I prefer rook takes e2. And the reason for this is that now white's position is suddenly under a lot of pressure, because the f3 pawn is still hanging, the b2 pawn is hanging, and most importantly, the bishop on c5 is hanging, which means that white has to do something about that bishop before they do anything else. Now, taking on c5 is also a good option here, and after the bishop moves to take the pawn on f3, and this one is still under attack, it felt a bit less unclear to me. So rook takes e2, and here my opponent made a mistake. But it was a very unfortunate mistake, bishop to d4, because this moves, to me, it looks incredibly natural. So you're protecting the b2 pawn, you're attacking the rook on f6. Unfortunately, the problem with it's not like rook takes f3, which is still pretty good, but most importantly, it's a rook f to e6. And what is this threatening? Well, rook e1 checkmate. Pretty serious. Once again, loads of love to my knight on h4. Here I was expecting from my opponent to go something like h3 or rook to g1, so just immediately stopping the rook e1 checkmate idea. But I was also really hoping for white to go bishop e3, and this move is a blunder. So pause the video here and see if you can work out for yourself why bishop e3, very natural, logical looking, is a blunder here. Well, I have to say, before I reveal the variation, that I don't know if this happens to anyone else, but in my head, while I was waiting for my opponent to make his move, so while I was here, knowing that bishop e3 is a blunder, but not knowing if they are gonna see if it's a blunder, I was just there like, bishop e3, please, move bishop e3, bishop e3, bishop e3, just like as if I could telepathically just throw my bishop e3 idea into my opponent's head. And believe it or not, it worked. Telepathy worked, because they did go bishop to e3 and I immediately went rook takes e3. And well, this is pretty much game over for white. And the explanation is simple and satisfying. After pawn takes e3, knight f3 threatens a checkmate that simply cannot be stopped. There is nothing here, not even throwing away all the rooks, that could save white for checkmate. So computer evaluates this position as checkmate in 5 moves, with white just dragging things along by giving a bunch of checks with the rooks on the back rank. And to me, this checkmate is really cool, because it's happening in a very endgame looking position. There are so little pieces left on the board, and I only have a rook and a knight, and somehow they are collaborating together to create an unavoidable checkmate idea. Not to pat myself on the back too much, but I really enjoyed finding this tactic. Now, the game went on for a little longer, so after rook takes e3, my opponent went for rook to f1, and at this point I had already relaxed, tell myself that I'm winning and that I can just kind of play whatever here. So I went for rook takes f3, which is not really the most efficient way to win. In the thematic context of this game, a very nice move would have been rook takes f2, that pretty much speeds up considerably the inevitable end of the game. On the same idea, if the rook takes on f2, then rook e1 is simply utterly checkmate. Well, this was it for today's game. Much more exciting than I thought it was going to be when I traded queens on e2. Hope you're glad you sticked around, and let me know what you think in the comments.